here to LiveNOW from Fox. I'm Andy Mack. Let's get into another story involving the former president, as the Supreme Court on Monday shut down a long shot push for Missouri to remove a gag order from the former president in this hush money case and delay his sentencing in New York. Some major news there as justices, according to former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani, friend of the program, saying the justices rejected Missouri's lawsuit against New York today. But it was an interesting legal strategy. Supreme Court has original jurisdiction over lawsuits between the states ahead of the appellate jurisdiction. So the Missouri AG trying to fast-track Trump's hush money immunity appeal rather than waiting for it to go through the normally slow appeals process in the New York courts. Unfortunately for Trump, it did not work. And let's bring into the conversation that man, Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor. Thank you so much for joining us. And just how unusual was this long shot, and what do we make of the ruling there from the Supreme Court?
Andy, it was very unusual. And we know, obviously, the Supreme Court hears appeals, but they do have original jurisdiction when it comes to disputes between the states. That means those types of lawsuits, they'll file directly in the Supreme Court. You have to get permission. It's called a bill of complaint. And that's what the Missouri AG tried to do. But historically, we're talking about land disputes over water rights. But in this case, what the Missouri Attorney General Bailey tried to argue was the gag order deprived Missouri voters of their right to hear the former president on the campaign trail. It was really a long shot, and a lot of law professors, legal scholars like myself thought there was no chance of success. But two of the more conservative justices, Justices Thomas and Alito, did say that they would have heard the case, but they wouldn't have granted other relief, which would have meant that they wouldn't have stayed or put on hold the New York case.
All right, that is very interesting, of course, coming from the Republican Andrew Bailey there in Missouri as they filed the suit. Let's get into original jurisdiction as well, because I think we were talking a lot about different Supreme Court decisions, immunity amongst them. How maybe is this different than some of the decisions that we saw a month ago or so?
Well, the original jurisdiction in this case would really help Donald Trump. And we've talked a lot on the show how procedure has helped the former president delay. The other three cases in D.C., South Florida was dismissed, and in Georgia, they've all been delayed for various reasons. And that's all helped the president, former president, because if he becomes president again, those cases have to be dismissed in D.C. and Georgia, but not so in New York. Delay is not helping him because it was, of course, scheduled to be sentenced in July 11th. That was pushed back to September 18th, but that sentencing is probably going to happen. And by the time that case works its way through the New York appellate courts, assuming, of course, the judge doesn't dismiss it based on immunity, that's scheduled to happen September 6th. That case has to work its way through the appellate division and maybe even the Court of Appeal, which is the highest court in New York. It's not called the Supreme Court. That's actually the trial court. And then by the time it makes its way to the Supreme Court, we're going to be well after the November election. So in this particular case, only, what Trump is trying to do is fast track that appeal to the Supreme Court because, of course, he has a favorable 6-3 conservative majority there.
All right, let's get into it. Just a little bit of a reminder for people, because we talked about the sentencing that was supposed to happen just days before the RNC in Milwaukee, now pushed back to September the 18th. What do we potentially expect in terms of sentencing here for the former president?
Well, first, the judge is going to have to rule on immunity. And there's two issues. Were these official acts? And I think the president is going to have an uphill battle to prove that the payments to Stormy Daniels and the reimbursement to Cohen were official acts. But if you read that Supreme Court opinion on immunity, there's some very powerful language that helps Donald Trump. And that language in the majority opinion is there can't even be the introduction of evidence of official acts. And there was a tweet in 2018 where Trump said he didn't know who Stormy Daniels was. And there's arguably some evidence that came into that New York case. And if so, that majority opinion said that was improper. So the judge is going to have to sort all that out, potentially order a new trial if the evidence came in wrongfully. If the president was immune, he would have to dismiss the case outright. But if none of that applies, then we're going to see the former president sentenced, and I fully expect him to be sentenced to probation. I don't expect any jail time in a case like this when we're well into a presidential election and he's a major party candidate.
And you mentioned the immunity, and maybe what's the likelihood that the sentencing actually happens on that date? Is it possible that it gets pushed? I mean, how likely is it that these circumstances force it to be moved just based on the complexity, like you mentioned, from what the Supreme Court said and now what the judge has to rule on?
It may get moved, and really one of three things will happen in early September on the 6th, or shortly thereafter, where the judge, Juan Merchan, makes his ruling. First is that the case is dismissed because Trump is immune. Second is that the judge orders a new trial because some evidence of official acts came in that shouldn't have come in. And the third is that those arguments are denied and sentencing moves forward. But if the judge needs additional briefing or there's a new argument that's made, I wouldn't be surprised if the sentence is pushed back so the judge can hear all these, because we know everything has to be briefed, everything has to be argued, because it's not going to stop here. This case will certainly go up on appeal regardless of what the ruling is.
Yeah, even though it was somewhat fast-tracked there for the Supreme Court, it's going to move very, very slowly. All right, Neama, I want to get your take, because we're just speaking with our Fox 10 reporter in Phoenix about the former attorney for the former president, Jenna Ellis, signing a cooperation agreement there around the fake electors case. And I do want to put up to some of these posts from you as well, saying after Jenna Ellis pleaded guilty to the Georgia federal election case and received probation, it was likely she would plead at Arizona as well. And this also moves on. Interesting, because you say Arizona prosecutors will likely focus their case on Rudy Giuliani and Mark Meadows. Give me an understanding from your perspective as a former federal prosecutor, when someone like this flips, how does maybe the next kind of a ball roll? How does the next situation happen unfolding?
As a prosecutor, you want to go after the people who you think are the most culpable or responsible. So, when I was a drug prosecutor, for instance, now it's going after the cartel. I try to go after the head of the organization, not necessarily the street level dealer. And here in this case, when Jenna Ellis pleaded guilty in Georgia and got 5 years probation, that writing was on the wall. She was going to plead in the Arizona case. She was going to roll. She was going to cooperate. And the fact that prosecutors in Arizona gave her such a good deal, dropping the charges entirely. If you're a criminal defendant, you take that and run all day, every day. And we know that Giuliani has dug in his heels. He said that he won't plead under any circumstances. There were some reports that Meadows was maybe trying to cooperate, but that hasn't gone anywhere. And given how Giuliani has litigated the civil defamation case, his bankruptcy case, I don't see any circumstance where he pleads, and I think he's going to be the #1 target of prosecutors in both Arizona and Georgia, and of course Donald Trump being the key target there in Georgia. He's not charged in Arizona.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. And I do want to ask you about this last tweet that you posted out about Ellis being cross-examined and the fact that she will be a powerful witness for the state if the independent evidence, such as written communications, can be corroborated. Maybe how powerful, how forceful will evidence and testimony from her be in this case around it with so many people involved?
Well, if you're a prosecutor, you don't want to rely just on cooperator testimony alone, because there are some jurors that will believe that this individual is a snitch or a rat and they can't be trusted, and they're just lying to save themselves. So you really want to corroborate their testimony. So whether it's emails, whether it's text messages, communications that really set forth this elector scheme, that's what you want, because they are always going to be subject to very aggressive and intense cooperation, that they're just lying to save themselves. Especially in a case like this, where you've already dropped the charges before the witness testifies. That's not what I like to do as a prosecutor. What I like to say is, you have an opportunity to cooperate. If you testify and you testify truthfully, then we can see what sort of reduction or deal that you can get. But when we've already given that on the front end, that really opens the door to them being called a liar, really just to save themselves.
All right, very, very interesting moving forward. All right, Neama, anything else? Because there are two very big developments today in both these cases there in Arizona and beyond with the Supreme Court. Anything else that you'd like to add before I let you go?
I think we're going to see some of the cases move quickly in D.C. We're going to see Tanya Chutkan. I think August 16th is the date that case is going to be back on track, and we're going to see whether Trump's conduct, there were official acts, and how that case is going to move forward. But again, not going to happen before the election. But that's the one that's most likely to go if Donald Trump loses.
A little bit of a lull, maybe a calm before the storm, if you so you speak. Neama, thank you again. I appreciate your time, your understanding here on Live Now from Fox.